Honestly, Lies of P is probably, I would say, one of the only actually pure successful attempts on making a literal game, a Souls game, I can actually classify as an actual Souls game. Majority of this industry has tried to attempt to copy the formula of the Soul series, but none really successful. Games like, say, Jedi Last Order or whatever took elements of it and did pretty well, or other games doing the same thing like that, or others straight up tried to make their own Souls games but failing miserably. Surge, for example, had a great concept with its ability that allows you to target the limbs of an enemy and to target that weak spot of an enemy, which is a cool concept, but really it was the only thing that was memorable about the game, since the game to me just wasn't really that incredible when it came to its narrative, its world, and vice versa. And this is honestly can't something I can't blame on the developers entirely, since capturing the formula of what makes a Souls game great is hard, very hard, and I feel like the company that made Lies of P did extraordinarily well at capturing every aspect to it by creating a very unique world that actually makes us, the player, more invested interest in it. Because every Souls games I played, I've always been intrigued by the world. Always, I always had this deep curiosity in me to actually be more willing to explore more of its world, like like towards the lands between, towards the great capital of Arelando, and vice versa. That's one of the things that FromSoft does incredibly well in its narrative, is to intrigue in its narrative and its world by intriguing the player to invest more into its game. Even Bloodborne is probably the greatest at it because its world is extremely fucking beautiful and it drastically changes depending on what you do in the narrative and story. And Croc to me feels like a beautiful world that is truly have reached the peak of its peak at technological advancements with puppets, where you can tell they have like heavily reached high up there with their puppets, but also it being a sign of their downfall, showing that they may many ways gone a bit a bit too far with the interesting concepts of puppets they came up with, but generally showing you that they were on top, they were at their peak, but eventually something would cause everything they built to crumble apart, driving you to be curious on why such a thriving city failed the way it did, making you intrigued revolving the puppets around the area and vice versa. Even the locations are pretty impressive and just something you just can't help but to awe. Even the hotel to me is probably the most memorable location in the game. Like, you just can't help but just look at it and just be impressed by its design. And the atmosphere and tone is actually something I feel like they did pretty well. Atmosphere and tone means everything in gaming. You always have to stick with it in each locations, wherever you go, and how you should feel in the area. Because it should feel alive, genuinely alive, like something you can generally see yourself being in. Bloodborne had a lot of areas where it feels very alive, desolate, and miserable. And Lies of P does pretty great at that. And every area feels very fresh and alive. And especially the music. The music does pretty good. I never had any problems with it, especially when it comes to bosses. Like, it plays really hard on certain bosses. Certain bosses are just really good with that sound design that comes with it. When it comes to the start of the gameplay, I do have mixed opinion at the start. At the start, it is ass. Like, if you're anyways used to playing Souls games when it comes to dodging, it feels very uncomfortable to dodge, because you can only do one dodge. And the frames for it is it's a bit small, because it makes me feel like the enemy can always have a chance to reach me as long as they have a longer weapon, and if they have a small attack, like hit the attack box, and then you won't have to worry. But longer attack range, whew, it sucks. Especially the game heavily encourages the player to parry, and I noticed that its system is drastically different from Bloodborne. In Bloodborne, you were always encouraged to be aggressive and never back down. And this one, it does encourage aggressiveness, but it also sometimes encourages you to parry. Not to block, but just to parry the attacks, and how parrying actually rewards the player. I never realized this until later on, until beating the game and getting more information, that parry actually has more viability in the game. That if you keep parrying bosses in a game, it can actually break their weapons, which is stupidly cool of a detail that can actually happen. And I really love that your weapon doesn't degrade as well. Your enemies' weapons can degrade as well if they fuck up the attack. And same thing with enemies around the world. They like breaking a weapon actually applies to even smaller enemies as well, which is incredible and a really cool concept in its design and in its gameplay. And I really love that, especially how it rewards you, that if you successfully land it, you gain the health you lost back instantly. Like in Bloodborne, you just have to keep attacking the enemy to get it back, but in this, you get it instantly back for doing a perfect block. But that's the thing I have an issue with, is the blocking itself. I mean, not the blocking, I mean parrying. I keep mixing those two up. I'm so used to saying blocking. But that's the one big issue I have, is the parry and properly getting the parry. Sometimes the window can be very hard depending on certain enemies. Some enemies can easily be predictable, others are very challenging, and due to the parry can be having a small window. But when you get past that small window, but certain players can likely be being more better at being patient and properly getting it. To me, I had a rough time actually learning and properly getting it. So a part of me kind of does think that does need to be fixed or improved, or maybe not. It's really hard to say, since it's just morely on my opinion and how I feel about the parry. There are times where it can be good, but there are times where it can feel horrible due to how small it is, and you have to be very perfect and precise with it. Besides that, everything else is perfectly fine when you get past the start. It gets more fun and more creative with a lot of things that the player is given. Like, one of the cool concepts is the fact that the player can dismantle any weapons you come across. You don't need to necessarily have the weapon the way it is. It's kind of like their version of trick weapons, but instead of the trick, you can take a part of a weapon that has a pretty good skill in it and place it with another one that has a really good skill that you prefer with. Like, each weapons have either a perfect guard, not perfect guard, has some better version of the normal guard, or some has a devastating attack, or another has an interesting type of status effect that can apply to the weapon. And what happens if you combine both of them to create a powerful weapon? It's a really good concept that allows players to have more ways of more versatile to play the game, have different ways that doing damage and so on. And I love that. That's a really good concept. Even the Fable Arts is a really, really good concept as well, that a player can in many ways rely on balancing it, since in Dark Souls, a lot of players balance the skill art of a weapon through, FP. With this, it's more different in how you can get that, and that you can get FP by attacking enemies and earning it through parries. And I even like that they allow you to buy the FP very quick, and you can actually do something pretty interesting with that, because when it comes to me and my playthrough, I bought a shit ton of that items to constantly allows me to get the Fable Arts very quick and efficiently, since after all you get a lot of ego in the game, so it's technically best to be encouraged to buy a lot of supplies during any missions or boss fights. Also, this is probably the only Souls game where players are heavily encouraged to use items. Items is never really utilized hugely in any games, in any Souls games. I've never really thought too much of me utilizing them. The only time I ever used them was the fire bombs and early start of Dark Souls, but never at all. Hell, even Elden Ring, I never used a lot of the items. It's probably one of the only games where items are actually useful, does a shit ton of damage, and actually is more encouraged to be used in boss fights, since it actually does change the way the fight goes down, allowing you to do different types of damage, elemental damage, if depending on grenades, or certain items that can stagger or do a bit of damage. That's actually a really good thing they've done there. FromSoft has never done pretty well with items, and they with items that can damage, and seeing them practically be able to be more useful is something I'm very impressed that they did. And when it comes to, say, the music, like the albums and the musics, I honestly say they're worth listening to deeply, since a lot of them are pretty good hits, while also fitting with the tone of the story and its world, which is something I actually appreciate when it comes to that, especially when it comes to its storytelling, since it may be, a bit linear, since some FromSoft games never hold your hand or do these types of things to tell you what's going on. This is the one where it technically does, but not to this extent, where the rest is just left up to you to really find everything on your own, but still giving you the basics of what you need to do. Find the king, pop it, kill his ass, find the alchemist, and so on and so on. And I honestly say that's a pretty good. It's not extremely bad in this and that. Like, they did well. I never really say they hold your hand in your entirety, but it's a really good story nonetheless. Even I love the fact that they have like a place to practice. And FromSoft, you never really have that type of area to practice in any of their games, and it's nice to have an area to test out what weapons you have, to see what Fable Arts works for you, and so on. And when it comes to the Legion Arms also are pretty good change pace of the game, and some of them I honestly say are pretty better than others. Others I practically never see myself using, since there's literally 4 of the items that are much quicker and honestly doesn't slow you down, which I'm referring to the flame arm, the electro one, and so on. Never tried the other 2 elements, but I honestly prefer items personally, since they're far more efficient and quicker, but it's nice that it's there. And down, the game is just extraordinary, and there's not really much to truly criticize, since during my entire playthrough I've never found anything that really truly bothered me or had issues. There was no glitches. The game actually run pretty well on Xbox. I guess it just depends on other people on other consoles like PC and PlayStation. They might have a different opinion, but regardless, it's practically a 10 out of 10 as a Souls game. I'm very much curious on where they're gonna go with this, because if they did well with this, it makes me wonder if they'll try to do this again. If so, there's probably the only company that will actually probably will be more investful in doing something similar towards what FromSoft does, and that's interesting. Now, I mean, interesting to see them deviate out of it as well, because FromSoft did that themselves with the revival of Armored Core, and I'm quite keen to see what they do in the future. And I'll remember the company that developed the game.